I would like to introduce our first speaker for this afternoon, Heather Dawn Thompson, member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe and Director of the Office of Tribal Relations at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we look forward to hearing more about making USDA responsive to Native people. So Heather, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Whitney, Tony, and Doug. It's so nice to see everybody today. My name is Heather Dawn Thompson. As Whitney just pointed out, I am a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and I am the Director of the Office of Tribal Relations for the USDA. Many of you know one of my predecessors, Janie Hipp. She was just confirmed to be the General Counsel for USDA, so I'm delighted to follow in her footsteps. So my title that I was given was Making USDA Responsive to Native People. And where do we begin? Tony, having been in this office, knows the difficulty of this title. USDA was not designed through an Indigenous lens. And none of its programs were designed originally with that focus. And in fact, as many of you know, historically, it was designed for the opposite purposes. I think FDIPR is a good example. They carry a heavy history with them. The commodities program was designed as an act of war to force Native Americans and tribes to behave. It was designed to destroy indigenous food systems so that natives did not have the freedom, so that they were in fact forced to be dependent upon the federal government, and so that we would behave. And everything else sort of rolled from there. And so when you're talking about making USDA responsive to Native people, the folks that work at USDA are amazing, right? Clearly they care about their customers and their constituents. But the entire program, the statutes, the regulations were not designed with us in mind. And so it's a heavy lift. This office has only been in existence for about 10 years. So Janie was the first, and then Leslie Wheelock, many of you know after her, and then Diane Crulo, and then myself, and that's it. So let me outline some of the things we're thinking about to address this question. One, of course, is consultation, and that is the burden and responsibility of the entire federal government, including USDA. But what you do with that consultation is the next question, right? We can talk and talk all we want, but if we don't take our trust responsibility seriously and listen to the tribal nations and implement those requests and work together, then we're not doing our job. So out of the gate this year, the first set of responsibilities that we focused on was equity. We did a series of consultations on what equity looks like to Indian country. And no surprise to a lot of you, many barriers came up. Really big systemic barriers. And that's what we've been focusing on first. Things like trust lands being ineligible for a lot of USDA programs because they're being miscategorized as federal lands. I mean, that's crazy, right? How do we serve our trust responsibility to Indian country if we make them own their land in trust and then we don't make them eligible for our agricultural programs? To add insult to injury, right, Native Americans were largely moved to our reservations with the promise that we would be agriculture in nature, that we would adopt these agricultural practices. So perhaps more so than any other agency besides the Department of Interior, USDA and agriculture has this trust responsibility that it really needs to take seriously. And if trust lands aren't eligible for all of our programs, we sure aren't doing our job. So that's one example. Another example of a barrier that we're trying to be responsive to is legacy preferences. I hear you're talking about rural economic development, tribal economic development. One of the biggest purveyors of grants and monies in this field, as you know, is USDA. Loans, grants, we are one of the biggest banks. I think we're the 7th largest biggest bank in rural economic development in the United States. But we have been giving legacy preferences. And what that means is whoever the borrower is that exists for infrastructure, telecom, electricity, we give them preference for the next set of loans or grants. But historically, we've never asked them to get permission from the tribe. So we have been federally subsidizing entities that have no permission from the tribal government to operate on that reservation. And then we're perpetuating that by giving legacy preferences. So we're rethinking what that looks like. And I think that folds really well into your co-op conversation today. right? For better or worse, the word co-op in a lot of places where I'm from in South Dakota is a bad word. And a lot of this is USDA's fault. It's our responsibility, right? Because we have been subsidizing entities without requiring them to coordinate or get permission from the federal government. So most of the co-ops in Indian country, not all of them, right? But most of the co-ops that Indian country affiliates the word with are largely non-native co-ops that are receiving federal funds to supposedly serve their communities and not doing so, and not being responsive to them, and not following tribal laws and regulations. And that has created a very complicated relationship that needs a lot of care moving forward. And then a second area that we're thinking about, and then we heard when we're trying to be responsive to Native people, is the indigenization of USDA. And what does that look like? And much credit to Secretary Vilsack. In one of our very first meetings, what he said to me when I was walking through these barriers, right? I was like, trust land's not eligible. We have these legacy issues. We have hiring problems. And he said, you know what, Heather? I don't know that USDA was created for Indigenous people. Let's rethink this. What does that look like if we were to start from scratch? Maybe we just need something different within USDA. And to be honest, it terrified me. I've never been given that much intellectual freedom. So I don't know that we have an answer yet, but I challenge you too to this conversation, because that's what we're thinking about internally at the Office of Tribal Relations. But to give you some examples, we are going to be launching an Indigenous Food Sovereignty Initiative at USDA. And all of that incorporates seed saving, right? Rethinking the USDA seed bank. We have a requirement that if you put seeds in, they become public property, right? That's a challenge for a lot of tribes that want to protect their intellectual property of their Indigenous seeds. We are thinking about foraging and what that relationship looks like with Forest Service lands. We're thinking about treaty rights, particularly on the federal lands that we have stewardship over. One of the things that we're doing with the Department of Interior is that we are creating, actually with Oklahoma State started it, right? The treaty database, they have Kapler's PDF in, but it's still really hard to navigate. And it's really hard for the federal government to uphold its treaty responsibility if it can't find the treaties and if it can't search them easily. And so we're going to create a word searchable, indexed by tribe, state, subject matter, right? Hunting and fishing rights, agricultural provisions, so that the federal government, its employees, can do its job in implementing the treaty and trust responsibility, find those treaties, understand their relationship, their obligation, and follow through. The Indigenous Food Sovereignty Initiative also incorporates rethinking what we are subsidizing in Indian country, right? The United States, not just USDA, the United States have sort of forced Western domesticated animals and monocropping on Indian country, which is fine for some of us. It's really working for a lot of communities, but it's not everybody's choice. But we haven't historically subsidized, invested in, incorporated Indigenous permaculture, Indigenous gardening, Indigenous foods. And so we're rethinking what that might look like. And then I know I'm coming up on my time, but one last thing is Indigenous ecological knowledge. I always sort of giggle. I say science is always catching up to Indigenous ecological knowledge, right? In the fire, we're seeing this now, right? With the increase in fires. The Indigenous communities have long had fire control provisions in their Indigenous ecological knowledge that a lot of our firefighting agencies are just now starting to think about and incorporate. Same thing with monocropping versus multi-cropping, rotation, incorporation of diversity in crops as you're growing, long-term Indigenous restorative agricultural techniques. Also with Indigenous foods for medicine. Where I'm from, one of our favorite foods is the chokecherry. If you look at non-native books, they always say they're poisonous, right? Because the seed has cyanide in it. But my favorite story is that we had a student from Cheyenne River, actually, as part of her, I think it was high school, wasn't even college, research, did the analysis that if you prepare it in the traditional manner in which you crush the seed with the berry acidity negates the cyanide and it becomes an anti-carcinogen. So reincorporating this traditional knowledge, food knowledge, into our science as well. So that's just some examples. I appreciate my time is up, but I wanted to share that the Office of Tribal Relations is hearing you. We're thinking about it. And these are just some of the examples that we're looking to implement in partnership with you. So thank you so much, Doug, Tony, and Whitney, for your time and for inviting USDA this week. I know my colleagues, Zach and Dr. Neal, were excited to visit with you earlier this week.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather Dawn Thompson. I appreciate your time and being here with us today and sharing more about systemic barriers within USDA and the importance of serving the trust responsibility. So thank you for sharing that.